Welcome back. In our first session, we talked about the big picture. God is urbanizing the world and internationalizing our cities. It's true on all 6 continents. It is massively true. City growth is about 100,000 per day. That's the net on all 6 continents. And the fastest growing cities, as I pointed out, are Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The church is in the middle of this, the greatest migration in human history, rural to urban, within the countries, and then in between the nations itself. In this session, I'd like to move a little bit to how that challenges us, how it challenges traditional ways of living and thinking and even organizational behavior. Let's define cities a little bit. Lewis Mumford wrote 27 books on cities before his death. In the article, City, in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, Lewis Mumford has a definition. He's clearly defining cities by the roles and functions they play. Now, this is a different way of defining cities from the way that the old sociologists used to define cities. Back when the University of Berlin and the University of Chicago invented urban sociology, and they had the great names of Lewis Wirth and Park and Burgess and all these people, they tended to define cities as places. And they used static categories like square miles, population size, population density. Those were the categories defining cities. But more recently, influenced by social psychology and anthropology, people are seeing cities more like the roles and functions they play. Cultural roles, political roles, and religious roles, economic roles. And so Lewis Mumford represents that. When he says the unique office of a city, he's talking about the roles they play, is to increase the variety, that is the pluralism. It's all reality in a confined space, speed it up. The velocity, the pace at which life moves. In fact, even your heartbeat goes up an average of 4 beats a minute when you move in a city. Imagine that. That's been measured in Mexico City, by the way. So you're not the same person. You change. Your behavior changes. Your heartbeat changes when you come in the city. The continuity has to do with institutions of history. There are artifacts and buildings around and railroads that remind us constantly of what the city used to be. But then the extent is the outreach of the city. And so the unique office of a city is to increase the variety, velocity, continuity, and extent of human intercourse. Lewis Mumford, article City in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences. Well, let me try to make it very, very simple. By urbanization, then, let me talk about the city as a place. Urbanism is the city as a lifestyle. That's another way of cutting the definition. By urbanization, we mean Dallas, Seattle, New York, Vancouver, Toronto. We mean the city as a definable entity. The influence of the city, broader in the culture, is the word urbanism. By my definition, then, as I've just shared it, urbanism can increase in Dakota, even as the population goes down. Out in my mythological rural town, Resume Speed, Kansas, that is where corncobs outnumber people. Basically, there's no street light. There's just that sign that says, when you get through the town, resume speed. But out there, if you notice, the banks are now linked to urban banks. The schools are on websites. The businesses are franchised. Very often, you think you're going to get away from the city. I have bad news. There's no place to hide. The people running away from New York are running into the people running away from Los Angeles, somewhere near Colorado Springs, I think. But I want to tell you, there's no place to hide from urban reality. Now, the city, obviously, then, has some structures that we need to know about. And I want to briefly describe several structural challenges. These are ways in which the city, as I've described it, challenges us. And one of the structures is just the sociological challenge. The sheer variety of people and the pluralism of the neighborhood. Stephen Thernstrom, in his magnificent book called The Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups, which discusses every ethnic group, published by Harvard's Belknap Press, has an essay in there where he says there are 14 steps from actually where you go from accommodating to integrating to assimilating of a culture. If you can imagine, that takes several generations. Imagine how complex a neighborhood is when people are moving through and sorting the baggage they have brought with them from descending culture. So even though you have a certain number of people in the neighborhood, those certain number of people are only partially in the neighborhood. They have family back in the sending culture. They have culture that they've brought with them. They have accountability structures back often in the sending culture. So the people are living in this kaleidoscope, but the people themselves are changing. It's very, very much a challenge. The sociological challenge is real. There's a structural challenge. Now, you can find out I don't spell well in any of the languages I've studied. I have to think about it. There's a building that's pretty well known architecturally in Chicago called the Hancock Center. The Hancock Center is actually a city. Down on the bottom is shopping centers. Here is businesses. This is another shopping center. These are condos. This is entertainment. This is media. The daily population of this building is 28,000 people. 12,000 live and work in the same building. Now, if I came to your church and I said, I have just discovered a town of 28,000 with no church, every denomination would rush out there and buy property. They'd put up a sign, Future Home, First Presbyterian, First Lutheran, First Baptist, First Methodist, First Congregational, First Catholic, whatever, right? We would do that. That's the way we did church. You think anybody's rushing in there to pay $1 million for a condo to open a great idea discussion group, which may in time become a church? I don't think so. How do you reach a world like this? And by the way, the police can't get in, the politicians can't get in, and the pastors can't get in. I call this the urban trinity. These are the 3 Ps. Those represent 3 major institutions. Politicians and pastors and police have to go through immense red tape to get through the door. This is the urban gated community. Now, this is going to increase. If you've ever been to Hong Kong or Miami Beach, you know what's happening in America is we pay for services on a property tax base. Correct? Those services are being passed down on the cities from the states and from the federal government. Now, Chicago only has 228 square miles. Singapore, the whole nation, has 232 square miles. That's the whole nation of Singapore, 232. 4 square miles more than the city of Chicago. Both cities and all other cities have a problem. How do you increase revenue when you only have a fixed set of miles? Well, it's very simple. You rezone. You rezone, you go from R2 to R8 residency, you push those towers in the air, which in effect is taxing the real estate. It's taxing the airspace. The city becomes a cube. This is the future. This is not going to make it easier to do church. In the name of the one who became flesh and dwelt among us, do we go in only by media? I don't think so. Can we pay millions for a little square foot of the land next door to this building to plant a traditional ministry that meets once a week on Sunday? I don't think so. We're going to have to be challenged, you see. The city is structurally challenging us. It is also challenging us financially. When I came to your church and I asked for my $1 million to get a condo going, your missions committee would adjourn and say we get more bang for a buck in the jungle, where it's a grass-thatched, dung roof kind of situation. That's the way we've sold mission. We haven't prepared the church for this. This is a huge, huge challenge. There is also a religious challenge, because it's no longer about interdenominations, about Catholics and Protestants and Pentecostals working together. Why, we've got the whole family of Abraham there, for starters. Muslims, Jews, and Christians side by side in the neighborhood. The mosque has come to the neighborhood. The Sikh temple is around the corner. The pluralism is there. That's a huge challenge. Your kids are going to school with people of other religions. A lot of Christian perks are disappearing in the cultures where this is happening. A lot of Christians are disoriented. They need to be propped up by these. There is also a huge psychological challenge. The psych challenge is that if you ask people in the city who they are, they don't tell you who they are. In a rural area, we do. Rural area, oh, who are you? I'm Bakke, and I live over there. In a rural area, we're defined by our geography and our family, our biology. In a city, you ask people who they are, and without even thinking, they tell you what they do. Oh, I'm a teacher. Who are you? I'm a lawyer. Who are you? I work for the gas company. That's how most of you introduced yourself. In a split second, when you introduced yourself, I could tell you've made the shift from rural to urban. And what that means, of course, is if you don't have a job, you've lost your identity. So unemployment in a city is far more damaging to people than unemployment in a rural area. You lose your identity. That's why many men won't come to a church, particularly blue-collar men, because they can't compete with the pastor's identity. If they don't have a job, they don't know who they are. You're asking them basically to strip and come into the world of the church where the pastor's identity is overwhelming. The concept of overload is something that social psychologists have taught us about. It's the elevator syndrome. The more you pack us together, the less we communicate. We are made to cocoon. Otherwise, we would hemorrhage emotionally. So just when you think, oh, let's call in Billy Graham and let's rent the stadium and talk to the masses, guess what? The city is turning inward massively. It is much harder to speak to the crowd. We don't talk about broadcasting in the city. We talk about narrowcasting. We talk about niche marketing in the mall today. Niche marketing. So the bigger the city, the smaller you have to think. Have you ever driven down the street and all of a sudden you realize, oh, I wonder if I stopped at the light? You can't remember. Have you ever walked down the street and all of a sudden become conscious of the fact you didn't see any faces? You don't remember the faces of the people you just walked by. We are fearfully and wonderfully made, said the psalmist. We are made to tune out. It's the concept of overload, which means psychologically, cities become harder to reach, more complex. The more we pack ourselves together, the less we communicate, the more we cocoon. That's a huge challenge to the church. The audiences are not as available. There is a church or ecclesial challenge. You've got different kinds of churches on every corner. And you discover that the city people are consumers of religious experiences. And they may find they've rejected brand name loyalty. Used to be you could be Lutheran or Catholic for life. Now you might have your kids in one church, and you might have your child in somebody else's nursery program. In fact, you might be viewing churches like you view restaurants and hotels. Say, oh, it's time to change. I have new needs now. Let's go find a church that will minister to my new feminism or our kids' needs. And so church shopping becomes the norm. And it's not unusual for families to be members of several churches at the same time. This is a huge difference from the old days. And there's this personal challenge. Where do you think we're going to get the personnel who can live as minorities? Because almost all ministry is cross-cultural in the city. I'm part of the 11% of God's earth that's white. 87% of God's earth is black and brown. 49% is yellow. Time magazine called it the browning of America. Most pastors come out of college in debt. They come out of seminary with debt piled on debt. Churches have not figured out how to pay for staff. And the same church denominations that wouldn't think of putting a person in a jungle without a furlough and at least a couple years of language study, those same denominations throw people into the city and say, produce. They don't give us the tools to exegete the community. They gave us the tools to exegete the scripture. But they haven't taught us how to read a neighborhood. They haven't taught us how to set boundaries. Because if you don't, you'll pay for it. You'll hemorrhage emotionally. You can't be the Messiah for everybody in your community. And the people in your community may be just the tip of the iceberg. Most of their family will not be in your community. So you're ministering to people, but people whose family is in Puerto Rico, people whose significant others to whom they are accountable are not in your community. How do you prepare yourself for that? How do you live in a port of entry community where the population is changing? These are the challenges to the traditional way of thinking about the church. So the city packages people. It is not neutral. I learned this in Seattle when Boeing lost a contract. I was a young pastor. We were in a building program, 350-member church. Boeing lost a contract. It was rescinded by the Kennedy-Johnson administration after the election. You see, the vice president who came from Texas had convinced the Catholic president from Massachusetts that jobs were important for his state. That's why NASA's in Houston. And that's why Robert McNamara, as Secretary of Defense, took away the largest contract Boeing had ever gotten, and my whole congregation in Seattle was unemployed, virtually overnight. In fact, Seattle was unemployed. It was extraordinary. There was a sign on the highway, "Will the last person to leave Seattle please turn out the lights?" That's when I began to realize the cities package people. A political decision 3,000 miles away to shift a contract and capital to Texas had unemployed my congregation on the West Coast. That's when I began to realize that cities are not just collections of people like rural areas. Cities package people. They package them in structures like this. They package them in segments so that we have political city, we have economic city, we have media city, we have university city, we have marketing city, we have deviant and derelict city, we have airport city. Probably 35 to 40,000 people just work 24 hours a day at DFW Airport, or O'Hare in Chicago is 46,000 people just work in the airport. 250,000 go there every day. These worlds of the city, the worlds of courts, the worlds of prisons, the worlds of conventions, every city has them. The members of our churches work in these worlds. The pastors have almost no access to those worlds. You see how different it is from the old days when the pastor could go ride on the plow with the farmer and speak from all those wonderful rural texts of the Bible about sheep and shepherds and vineyards. And the pastor could be truly the parson who knew everything in the neighborhood. How does the pastor get a hold of this? The pastor has to have a lay theology. The pastor has to have a theology of place. The pastor has to have a Colossian theology of Christ above the city, but also a Philippian theology of Christ in us. The public Christ of Colossians, The Christ who is Lord of the whole city. We have to have that anchor in Colossians. That Christ who can take on principalities and powers. At the same time, we have to have that Philippian Jesus who gave up power and takes up residency in the human heart. We have to balance those. The public Christ above us, the personal Christ in us. One is Reformed, one is Wesleyan. We have to bring those things together. And in order to cope with this structure of the city, see, we have to keep our theology in balance. We have to understand. I love to take my students into a supermarket. I give them 30 minutes to go in and exegete the neighborhood. Try it sometime. How has the food business changed in the last 30 years? Remember when it closed at 8 or 9 o'clock at night? Remember when 7-Eleven came on and said, hey, we're going to sell groceries at 7 to 11? And people said, no way. That'll never work. Nobody buys groceries that long. Guess what? Passé now, isn't it? Supermarkets at 24 hours. Supermarket used to have 8,000 products. Now they have over 30. There's been a revolution inside the supermarket. Why? They have all kinds of food. They have ethnic food, right? How many ways can you spell rice? They have it from all over the world. Minnesota brown rice to Asian rice, Latin, everything. When the students come out, they are just delighted to tell me all these changes. There's been a management revolution. They outsource the dairy and the meat and all of these things. There's been a management revolution in the food. It's become a food mall. We walk over to a nearby church. We look at the sign. Morning worship, 11 o'clock, one language. As it was in the beginning, will now, and ever shall be, world without end, right? Then we have to ask this question. How is it that the supermarket, presumably without the Holy Spirit, got in touch with this world, and the church, presumably with the Holy Spirit, is still playing the 19th century game? In the midst of the structures, the good news is that some institutions have found a way to live and work in this system. Police departments and supermarkets are among those institutions that ought to be a guide to the church. So we're saying the world is urbanizing. That's not all good news. That there are some very, very serious challenges to that world. And it's a world that you and I know is going to cause us to change a lot of things. It challenges very fundamental practices of the church, even more theological ways of thinking about the nature and mission of the church. And this is true on all 6 continents now. This is what's happening. So this is the challenge. In our next segment, I want to come back and talk about how did this happen? How do world-class cities get started, and what can we learn from that pattern of history? We just don't jump automatically to this. What were the ways in which cities ramped up? How can we learn from that experience? Now remember, urbanization, we're talking about the city as place. These are place realities. But urbanism, we're talking about the city as lifestyle. So the city, you've got to see it as a giant magnet. It sucks things in and it packages them. The city is also the woofer and tweeter of an amplifier system. Everything that's here gets spewed out on the total environment. The city is a stage prop of an amplifying system. Here's my challenge. If the church can penetrate the city, the nation will hear the message. That's the good news. The good news is that if we penetrate these systems, if we somehow find a way to make the church credible in these kinds of environments, in the midst of these kinds of structures, you don't have to run all over the world to evangelize the world. The gospel will travel all over the world because the city will magnify the message to the countryside. We'll come back in a few moments and talk about that.